we have guest speaker Dewayne Everettsmith, who is from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, who'll be speaking today about Tasmanian Aboriginal cultural competency. I will now hand over to Dewayne.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you for that introduction. Yapaling and Amapali. Hello, welcome all. That means in my language, Palawa, Tasmanian Aboriginal language. It's great to be here today to provide you with an overhaul of our cultural competency training that we offer here at the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. So a little bit about myself. I am the Cultural Unit Coordinator for the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, and under my portfolio here is cultural competency training. Something that I'm really passionate about, and I've been doing for a little while now. I've been doing cultural competency training since I was about.
Sorry, we can't hear anything. I can see you speaking, but we can't hear anything at all.
Hi, I'm able to hear, so there may be an issue with the Zoom setting. I'll just help you in the chat box.
All right, I'll continue, and hopefully you guys can catch up there, get your sound working. So as mentioned, I'm really passionate about cultural competency training. It actually stems back to my family, the Smith family, from the Nichols River area, and my Aboriginal grandfather and non-Aboriginal grandmother. And I actively seen the inclusiveness within my family. Also seen the roles non-Aboriginal people can play in building cultural competency and comfortability and safety within, not only in the broader community, but within families. So my non-Aboriginal grandmother, she was a big part of us learning our cultural identity, who we are, where we are from. And so that made a big change in our life as Aboriginal people. So just a little bit about myself. On the next page here is my ancestors and where I'm from. And so up in the left-hand corner is my grandfather, Menelagena, who was the great last traditional chief of Tasmania before the full impacts of British colonisation and invasion. And he was from the northeast of Lutruwita of Tasmania. And a large majority of our community are descended from him through his daughters, who were kidnapped and taken to the islands. So Lungtalanana, Clark Island, Cape Barren Island, and Flinders Island. Also in the bottom left-hand corner there is my great-great-great-grandmother Tanganutra, who's the mother of Fanny Cochrane-Smith, who's in the right-hand side. And they both are traditionally Northeast Nation people as well, from northeast of Lutruwita, Tasmania. And most people are familiar with Fanny Cochrane-Smith because she was the first and last to record our traditional songs, our cultural songs, in language before we had the full impact. She was the one that survived and was able to pass on that knowledge of song and language. So a lot of our language has been reawakened from her recordings of singing in language. And in the middle there is her family. She had up to 12 children. So she had a big family with William Smith, and they all lived in the Nichols River area down Cygnet. So I'm a proud Palawa. I'm a Tasmanian Aboriginal man. I don't come from anywhere else in the world. I am Palawa, Tasmanian Aboriginal person from this island, Lutruwita, Tasmania. And we as Palawa people are very proud of that fact, that we have been connected to this island for always, that there has not ever been a time where we have not been connected. When I was, like I mentioned, back in the early 1800s, there was kidnapping of Aboriginal women and girls from the Northeast Nation, or the northeast of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and they were kidnapped and taken to the islands, Clark Island, Cape Barren Island, for their knowledge in hunting still, but also sexual slavery. Out of that sexual slavery was born another Aboriginal community, and including ancestors of my great grandmother Isabel Beaton and my grandfather Benjamin Everett were both born and raised on those islands. And when my grandfather was about 16 years of age, he actually left Cape Barren Island and he went to what we call Victoria today, but we call it Koori country. And he specifically went to Gunai country, which is near Bairnsdale or Lake Tai entrance, where he met my grandmother, Stella Hood, who was living a semi-traditional lifestyle. She was an Aboriginal woman put on the Aboriginal mission over there. And so he met my grandmother, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, the father of my grandmother, actually forbidded the marriage between my grandfather and my grandmother because he didn't see my grandfather as a true Aboriginal man. So he actually forbidded that marriage. My grandparents didn't listen. They were young lovers in love and didn't want to listen to that cultural requirement. Was my mother, Dewayne Everett, who was born in Sale on my grandmother's traditional country, Gunai country. And so because my mother, Dewayne Everett, was born and has linkage to Gunai country, she is considered Gunai Nation, not palawa, not from my community here. So one big cultural difference between that a lot of people don't understand is how we define where we're from. And because my mother was born on that country and her mother was from that country, she's officially from Gunai country. But it was around 7 years of age. My grandfather actually brought his family back to Lutruwita, Tasmania, and specifically Patawai, Burnie. And they were actually homeless, living in a tent on the beach there. And when my grandmother was about 35 years of age, she sent my mother and my aunties off to play. And upon their return, my grandmother had passed away, and she passed away due to complications of a brain tumor. And she's buried in Patawai, Burnie. And that's really quite culturally significant. And the reason being is our cultural value and belief as Aboriginal people is that we can only return home to the dream time or the dreaming, as some of you may commonly know it as. We call it the creation here in Tasmania. We can't return to our dreaming or the creation until we've been laid to rest or been given traditional ceremony on our traditional lands. So my grandmother has not been sent home to her ancestors because she was never buried or given ceremony on her traditional country. But it was around this time in the 1970s, the Tasmanian government forcibly removed my mother and my aunties. They stole my mother and my aunties from my grandfather and put them in a home in Launceston. And so what a lot of people don't realise is that the stolen generation, by definition, by terminology, continued to the 1970s here in Lutruwita, Tasmania, which I might add is about 30, 40 years post World War I, World War II. And I point that out because something we hear a lot as Aboriginal people is get over it. It happened so long ago. Yet the stolen generation was continuing past World War I, World War II. So I'm highlighting here some of the hypocrisy we have to deal with as Aboriginal people and the insensitivity towards us as well. So they put in a home in Launceston when my grandfather fought for my mother and my aunties for years to have them returned to his custody. Eventually won that battle, and then they came to live in Nipaluna, Hobart. And that's where my living stories begin. I was born at the Royal Nipaluna Hospital, the Royal Hobart Hospital. I spent the first 6 weeks of my life in hospital before my mother could take me home, where I lived with her for about 3-4 years in Bridgewater. And then she gave me up for adoption. And that's where I went to live in the Channel area. So Margate, Snug, Kingston, and was adopted by the Smith family. Only to later find out that I wasn't just a Smith through adoption. I'm actually biologically a Smith through my father as well. And in recent times, I found out who my father is. So that's a little bit about myself. And so just as a quick activity, if you've got a bit of paper in front of you, what I would like you to do is just write down something that you love about Lutruwita, Tasmania. What is it, something that you really connect with Lutruwita, Tasmania? So is it a special place? You may have a special place that you go to from a camping or fishing point of view. You may go there and sit on a particular bench seat in a park on the beach somewhere. Is there a beach or a lake that you'd like to visit? But if you could just write down that special place for me on a bit of paper, that'd be great. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. You might actually write about a particular smell. You might like the smell of the gum leaves, our wet forests. You might like the smell of our beach. So write it down. Whatever it is that you love about Lutruwita, Tasmania, write it down. All right, and these special places that you like, the smell or a particular place, wouldn't be as much so important to you if it wasn't for stories. And stories usually are given to us by our family or people who are important to us, friends, family, work colleagues, etc. So I would ask you just to quickly write down names of people who mean the most to you in your life on that bit of paper as well. And you can include pets if you want to. So as you're doing that, what I will mention is I am making assumptions to your knowledge of cultural competency, but I'm beginning everybody at the beginning. Some of you may have done training, some of you may have not. So I'm just starting at the beginning for everybody today. All right, so that leads us quite beautifully into welcome to countries or acknowledgement of countries. And I really don't like that terminology because we can't welcome people who are already here. And so I prefer to call them welcome to stories or acknowledgement of stories. I think that is a far better terminology in the context to how we use welcome to countries and acknowledgement of countries today. So we've all heard welcome to countries, or some of us may have given an acknowledgement of countries. So we're all somewhat aware of what they are. What people do not realize is that the practice of welcome to countries and acknowledgement of countries go back prior to the impacts of British colonisation and invasion. So welcome to countries and acknowledgement of countries are a cultural practice that existed before the arrival of European culture here in Lutruwita, Tasmania. And so a welcome to country was always given when another nation, clan or family group would come into another clan, family group or nation's land. And so they had to be welcomed onto that country or to that land with specific rules around what are the boundaries and the rules that you are setting to how long you can be here, what resources you can take, and when you need to leave by. And as part of that welcome, the nation who wanted to access that land or those resources had to give an acknowledgement of being in another person's home or another community's home, and that they will abide by the rules or the cultural law that has been laid out. And so that welcome to country and acknowledgement of country was an actual cultural practice prior to impacts of British colonisation and invasion. However, they have changed context today. We are living in a different world. So what does a welcome to country and acknowledgement of country mean for non-Aboriginal people? So welcome to countries can only be delivered by Aboriginal people. They are something that only Aboriginal people can deliver. However, acknowledgements of countries are what are delivered by non-Aboriginal people. Now, the main emphasis on why non-Aboriginal people need to deliver acknowledgements is around building cultural safety. And to give it context, so think about it from our context where if you would travel the world, you're traveling all over the world, you might have been maybe home for a little, away from home for a little while, you're homesick, and you come across a pub that's Australian themed, for example, it has the Australian flag, it plays the national anthem, and instantly you feel a sense of home. You feel like you think of all the memories and the people of home, you feel safe. It gives you just that warm feeling of home that you need. Well, acknowledgement of countries act as the same thing for Aboriginal people. And so by delivering an acknowledgement of country, what you're saying to us is that you respect us, you acknowledge us, but also you're building cultural safety. You're saying to us that we are safe to engage with you and within this environment. So it's a really important part of how you provide cultural safety to Aboriginal people. But also what we'd like you to throw in there is an element of your connection to place. Because like I said, we acknowledge that a lot of people find this place home, Lutruwita, Tasmania, find it home. Sorry, I'm just in a form at the moment. So a lot of people find this place home. And so what we need is for people to acknowledge their connection to place and space. Let me give you an example of an amazing acknowledgement that I have heard. So I was at a conference a few years ago and a lady was giving an acknowledgement. She acknowledged Aboriginal people, our elders, past and present, again. Most people throw in emerging in there. We don't know why people throw in emerging elders. We don't like emerging elders. We like you to just say elders past and present. We like you to acknowledge, as this woman did, at the skies, land and waterways. We are connected to the skies, land and waterways of Lutruwita, Tasmania. But so she acknowledged those fundamentals. She acknowledged our elders, our continued connection to the skies, land and waterways, and she paid respect to our community and activism that we've had for many years for our rights as Aboriginal people. But then she went on and talked about how she goes to this particular beach on the northeast of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and she sits at that beach with her family. She takes in the smells, and she talked about how she loves diving in the waters at that beach. And when she's diving in those waters, she imagines how she's swimming with, or how Aboriginal women used to dive in and out of those waters hunting for seafood. And so she talked about how she had that special connection to those Aboriginal women just for her love for that water and their love for that water as well. So what we want to hear in the acknowledgements is we want to hear fundamentals, acknowledge our elders past and present, a continued connection to skies, land and waterways, but we also, what makes an acknowledgement not tokenistic is you move it into the space of how you are connected to our values as an Aboriginal person. So what is special about this place? Why is it special to you? And how do you find that connection with us as Aboriginal people? So that's what we want to hear. We want to hear those things. However, I might add, there are different ways to provide acknowledgements. And yes, we are the same as Aboriginal fellas. We hear people get up at it. We'll be at conferences or meeting, and everybody that stands up gives an acknowledgement. And don't get me wrong, we're very appreciative of it, but it is very repetitive. And so we don't require everybody to do an acknowledgement at the meeting, but there are other ways you can do acknowledgement that are not just verbal acknowledgements. So you need to think about your space and your environment. Can you display Aboriginal flag around? That is an acknowledgement. Just one way to show acknowledgement. With the Aboriginal flag, have you got a plaque on the wall in your meeting room? That would also be appropriate as an acknowledgement. So you don't always have to give a verbal acknowledgement. Look at your environment and what about your environment are you setting that builds acknowledgement for Aboriginal people. So I'll just plant that seed. There's probably a lot more questions in regards to that, but hold on to those questions and we'll visit them closer to the end. All right, so I'll move on from that. So I've got a quick icebreaker, and Lauren, you might be able to help me here because I'm not sure. I'm used to Teams and not Zoom, but I would like people to comment. So can they do that? And,
yes, they can comment in the chat.
And what I don't think I can see it, so I might leave you to have a look over this, Lauren. But what we're going to talk about here is terminology, and we're going to do a quick icebreaker. And this icebreaker is one truth, two lies. So out of these three statements, one of them is the truth and two of them are a lie. And so in Lutruwita, Tasmania, do you refer to us as Aboriginal, Indigenous, or First Nations people? One of them is the truth and two of them are a lie. So it's a quick icebreaker, one truth, two lie. What I'll get you to do is write what you think is the correct terminology in the comments section. And we'll see what generally people are feeling. So in Lutruwita, Tasmania, do you refer to us as Aboriginal, Indigenous, or First Nations people? And I've just figured out how to read the chats.
Okay. Getting a lot of A's for Aboriginal.
Mm-hmm. Got a C.
A few C's.
We've got no B's. That's interesting. No, I just said that to throw doubt into the room. I did, Lauren. That's why I did that. But the correct answer, well, technically, you are all wrong, but I did set you up for fail on that one. You got to remember that Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations is all Western terminology. It's all a dominant culture putting their labels on Aboriginal people. And so it's never our preference to be called by Western terminology. In Lutruwita, Tasmania, we like you to refer to us as palawa, P-A-L-A-W-A. P-A-L-A-W-A. So I'll write that in the comment section for you, right there. And palawa means Tasmanian Aboriginal, and that is our cultural name that specifically says we are Aboriginal people from Tasmania. But you also may hear the word pakana, which I'll also type in to the comment section. And so pakana also means Tasmanian Aboriginal, but it is one of those things we like to use internally. So we as palawa people refer to each other as pakana, but we like non-Aboriginal people to refer to us as palawa. So that's a really important difference, and knowing that cultural difference is really important too. You also may hear us use difference of terminology as well. So balawa for palawa, you may always hear, or bugana for pakana. But we like you to stick with what I've explained here, so palawa and or pakana. So really important, and you'll also find that no matter where you go in Australia, all Aboriginal communities would prefer you to call them by their cultural names. So really important that wherever you go, work, live, play, that you learn the local cultural names of those communities and you refer to them by their terminology. And it is one way of activism. It's very small, but it's one way you say we support you. But also when we hear you use our terminology, you build cultural safety. So it tells us straight up, I was safe to engage with you because you removed your barriers, almost the ego to go, well, I'm going to use your cultural names over Western terminology. It actually is quite a big statement in getting that terminology correct. However, we all work in the Western system, in that bureaucratic system, and government, federal government do push terminology down and require to use specific terminology and specific Western terminology. If you are going to use Western terminology for us when referring to palawa people, we like you to use Tasmanian Aboriginal. That is the correct terminology from a Western lens. I'm going to type that into the comments section, but I'm going to also spell Aboriginal wrong, as I always do, but I've now corrected by using spell check. We like you to use Tasmanian Aboriginal because it's the next best thing to calling us palawa. And because what you're highlighting specifically is we are Tasmanian Aboriginal persons, specifically from Tasmania. So that's why we like you to use that. Aboriginal is our preferred terminology because by definition it means the first people of the land. So it's always our preference to use that word Aboriginal because it specifically means first people of the land. And when you consider that the big push of the British government was to claim terra nullius, that there were no humans here prior to British colonisation invasion, Aboriginal autonomy is very important that we use that because it highlights there were first people here before the British came here. So we like that. However, another small difference that I want to highlight is that there is a difference between Tasmanian Aboriginal people and Aboriginal Tasmanians. Yes, you're going, what? What's the difference? Well, this was why we're here. So Tasmanian Aboriginal people, palawa, they're Aboriginal people specifically from Tasmania. Aboriginal Tasmanians, Aboriginal people come from the mainland to live in Tasmania, and they're not from our community. And that's a really important cultural difference you must understand. And I kind of touched on that with my mother. My mother is Aboriginal Tasmanian, although I'm Tasmanian Aboriginal, and that's based on that cultural practice of her being born on her traditional mother's country. And so to understand that difference is really important because you can only consult with Tasmanian Aboriginal people, with palawa people, not Aboriginal Tasmanians. And it's really important when you go through that process, you find that difference out. Are you from Tasmania? Are you from the Aboriginal community in Tasmania? Or are you from a mainland Aboriginal community? Because if they're from another community, external from here, you can't consult with them on our behalf. I hope I've made sense of that. Again, if there's any questions, just type them in the comments section and Lauren and I will just keep a track of those. And Lauren might spark me every now and then if I've forgotten something.
I will.
Thanks, Lauren. Indigenous. Most people, this is pretty common terminology, but we do not like Indigenous. Do not use Indigenous to refer to us because by definition, Indigenous means somebody who's born here. And so anybody who's born in Tasmania or born in Australia, no matter where you're from, if you are born here, you are classified as Indigenous. And what people don't realise is that comes from the John Howard era. if you remember that beautiful era of the 90s and early thousands. But John Howard pushed Indigenous, and the reason he did this is he wanted to assimilate us by using terminology, because what happened is by referring to us Indigenous, non-Aboriginal people were now saying, I'm Indigenous too. And they weren't wrong, because if you were born in Australia, you were classified as Indigenous. So what it started to do was put us all in the same basket. Meaning we're all the same, we all get treated the same, we all have the same rights, and we all have the same cultural values and beliefs. It started putting us all in the one basket. Now, there's nothing wrong with diversity. As Aboriginal people, we don't consider ourselves Australian. We consider ourselves as a sovereign people and self-determined people. We also have different cultural values and beliefs. When I say that, that is just the pride in my identity. That is not taking away anybody's right to connect how they want to connect. That's who I am. I am palawa. But what Indigenous did was took that and put us in one basket, meaning we don't have to really much change anything. We don't have to specify services, or we don't have to do acknowledgements. We don't have to do this anymore, because why would we when we're all Indigenous? So that was the line that John Howard was going with. So it's actually assimilation through terminology John Howard was using. And then C, First Nations. We much prefer first custodians. We don't like first owners or first landowners, because we're never owners of the land. We're only custodians, because land owns us. So that's really important to note as well. So first, what we'd like you to do is use first custodians or First Nations people when referring to us as a whole. So if you're taking all Aboriginal communities around Australia and putting us in one basket, use First Nations there. If we're talking about all Aboriginal people all over the world, your Native Americans to South America, etc., Pacific Islands, call us all First Nations in that context when you want to put us all in one basket. But always localize your terminology according to the community where you work, live, and play. All right. Hopefully you're learning something new. Can we give a thumbs up in the comment section if you are learning something new, just so I know I'm heading in the right direction. Good. I'm getting a few there. That's awesome. That's really good. Again, if you've got any questions about that, just chuck it in the comments section, and I can do my best to keep an eye on it and answer that for you. All right, so let's go to the next activity. Hayley, you're going to keep me on track, aren't you? Because I can talk for ages. That's my problem. Lauren, sorry.
I'll keep you on track. Yeah.
So I'm going to get you to push your boundary just a little bit. And so when we talk about cultural safety, let me give you a story. This is how you can measure cultural safety within a particular environment or of another culture onto another culture. So here's a story. I would go to the old Purity in Kingston Town. So yes, I still call it Purity. Does anybody remember it as Purity? Which is now Woolworths. We all call it Woolworths, but back in the day we called it Purity, and I liked it because you could say it with a slight bogan tang. That's what I love about saying Purity. But anyway, the old Purity or the Woolworths at Kingston Town, I'll be going there. I'll be there with my 3 young children who are quite young. You know, I had a 9-month-old, around a 2-year-old, and a 5-6-year-old boys. I'll be there with my kids. I have a shirt on. That shirt would have the Aboriginal flag on it. No different of a statement to if somebody wore the Australian flag on their shirt. I'm making no different of a statement. But I'm there, my flag, and I'll be minding my own business. I'll just be there shopping, getting food for my kids. And on numerous occasions, I'd be confronted in the supermarket in front of my children because I had the Aboriginal flag on it. It will go something like this. You're just dividing the community. You're not even black. You're not really Aboriginal. So how do you claim to be Aboriginal if you're not black? I look at you. I've got a bigger nose than you. I'm more Aboriginal than you are. Why don't you get over it? It happened so long ago. The amount of times I've had these comments made in front of me, to me, in front of my children, was quite phenomenal. If I had $1 for every time, I reckon I'd be a millionaire. But at that point in time, having young children, I wasn't willing to compromise my children's safety for the benefit of my pride as an Aboriginal person, as a Palawa person. So what did I do? I stopped wearing the shirt with the Aboriginal flag in public. And so what I did was I blended. I blended with the general public to avoid racism and discrimination. And so I'm talking about blending it from a race level, but blending also happens from a sexuality point of view, from a social class point of view. It happens in many forms, many ways. Mine is race. And so I blend. So I stop wearing the shirt, don't point out anything about being Aboriginal, therefore I can avoid racism and discrimination. However, what's really derogative about these scenarios is not that I'm dealing, one, with the racism and discrimination. It's two, it's how I deal with it. Because if I react negatively or angrily at this racism and discrimination, what I get labelled is as the typical angry Aboriginal person, just angry all the time. And so I've got to deal with it. And so the third layer then is that then I just blend. And so when you're having to blend and hide a part of your identity, then you're not in a culturally safe environment. That is the perfect measure of cultural safety, is if you have to hide or not disclose your identity, then you're not in a culturally safe environment. So what I want you to do in the comments section, and I will highlight now that because I realise that your names do come up on the thing, so I'm asking you to push your boundary here. I'm not taking it as a matter of fact. This is just to get you to thinking about stereotypes and myths of Aboriginal people, and nothing will be. Everything's in confidentiality, so we will respect that as we go through this. So you don't have to be nervous or feel unsafe in sharing these comments. What I want you to do is I want you to, in the comment sections, I want you to write down a negative comment or stereotype. Negative comment, stereotype, or myth you've heard, said, or seen about Aboriginal people. I want you to comment or write a message, a negative comment, stereotype, or myth you've heard, said, or seen about Aboriginal people. I'll begin it. No offence, but you can't be Aboriginal because Truganini was the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person. No offence, but your blue-eyed blonde hair. Oh, Louise just beat me to it. Blue eyes and blonde hair. Therefore, you're not really an Aboriginal person, are you? No offence, but why is it offensive to call an Aboriginal person a gorilla? I don't get it. It's just a joke. All right, so now I'm going to get you to push yourselves a little bit more, because this is about challenging mindset. Because what is scary is that you were able to comment something. That's the point, is that there's still racism and discrimination that exists because you are able to comment. And so that really gets you to push that idea, because what we hear is that there's no such thing as racism or discrimination in Australia. But there is, because you are able to comment. You've either heard, said, or seen these things at some point, in some way. But now, what I want you to do is I want you to write down in the comments section, I want you to write how much Aboriginal you think I am. What percentage of Aboriginal do you think I am? Do you think I'm 100%, half caste, quarter caste, 1/8, 1/6 Aboriginal? What percentage Aboriginal do you think I am? And you don't have a choice. You have to comment. Perfect. Thanks, everyone. I thank you all for being courageous and brave and sharing your thoughts and what you're thinking. But it is to challenge mindsets. This is what I'm pushing. So the first thing I would say to you is that, and I'm going to leave it in the comments section right now, is that we are a culture, not a colour. We are values, not a look. And that is the best way to describe Aboriginality. And the way that I push this is to go this. If you were to go to a pub and you meet an Irishman, and that Irishman says to you, I don't know why you're meeting this Irish in the pub, I'm making assumptions, sorry about that. But you meet this Irish in a pub and he said, I'm Irish, proud to be Irish, I'm Irish through and through. Is our initial thoughts to respond to this Irish guy with what percentage Aboriginal are you? What percentage are you? You're not a real Irishman because you don't have red hair and you don't have Celtic tattoos. So you're not a real Irish, are you? But then let's me push it another further. When somebody says to me, I'm Australian, Aussie, oi, 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 Aussie through and through. And then do we go to people who identify as Australian? Do we go, well, you're not a real Australian because the real Australians, they drove around in a horse and cart and they held up a candle for light. So you're not really a real Australian now, are you? Well, what is the definition of Australian? Really? So what percentage are you? We don't do that. But then to push you even more, we think about religion and Christianity in particular. And we go, well, Jesus lived about 3,000 years ago and you identify as Christian, that makes you about 70th generation Christian, you're this much Christian. Do we do that? So what we've got to ask is, what is the intentions? If we don't do it to all these other cultures and identities, why do we do it to Aboriginal people? Why do we put a number on Aboriginal people? And the reality is it goes back to the assimilation of Aboriginal people through the breeding out policy. And the breeding out policy was that they identified that between the European gene and the Aboriginal gene, our gene was the weaker gene. So therefore, come grandchild or great-grandchild, we no longer looked Aboriginal to them, black, we now looked European. Therefore, we have bred out the black. And so that's where these numbers come into play, 100%, 50%, 20%, 10%, half caste, quarter caste, 1/8, 1/6. All that comes out of that breeding out policy saying, if we can't kill them, we'll breed them out. Therefore, if they don't look Aboriginal, they're not really Aboriginal. And so that's where that numbers and that concept of questioning Aboriginality comes from. And so it's really inappropriate. We don't do it to anybody else, and it's not okay to do it to Aboriginal people. I am palawa. I am Aboriginal through and through. I'm not a percentage. I'm not a number. I'm Aboriginal through and through. I've also culturally been brought up as Aboriginal. I live and fight for the rights for Aboriginal people. But what's really important is the trauma. And what I find really interesting when people go to me, well, you're only a little bit Aboriginal. Are you telling me that the trauma associated, the intergenerational trauma that I feel is only 20% of my 100% of being? I live with 100% of the trauma of what it means to be Aboriginal and have lived with that intergenerational trauma within my family. So, like I said, we are a culture, not a colour. We are values, not a look. We know that about ourselves and we know that about others, that you identify according to how you've been raised and what you identify as. So I get you to question that, putting a number on specifics on Aboriginal people, because I might not live a traditional lifestyle, but I'm still as much Aboriginal as those who lived a traditional lifestyle to a more contemporary Western influenced lifestyle. I hope that's helped you. We are a culture, not a colour. We are values, not a look. And so I wanted to go back to the comments as well. What's really important about these comments, like I said, is that you're able to make them. And that is the issue, that we are able to make them. And there are a lot of mistruths out there around government incentives, wanting money, all those kind of things, but just to exacerbate a narrative about another culture. That's just not true. Do we have alcohol issues within our community? Yes, no different to the broader communities. Do we have violence, family violence, and general lateral violence involved in our community? Yes. No different to any other community, but it is an issue that we face in Australia. It's not unique to Aboriginal communities. However, ours is exacerbated due to the racism and discrimination that we sometimes we experience. All right, I hope you learned something new there. I'm going to move on, but if you do have any questions, ask away. How long do you reckon I got here, Lauren?
So we've got 15 minutes left of the time, and I suppose we'll have the last 5 or 10 for questions. So you've got another 5 or 10 minutes.
Beautiful. I can rush through. So I will rush through just a little bit, but I wanted to begin with our creation story. And what's really important about Aboriginal people is that land owns us, not that we own land. So Western culture has the concept of buying land, we own it. For Aboriginal people, land owns us. And our creation begins with Panopira, the sun, and Wheatley, the moon. And we believe that Lutruwita, Tasmania began as a little sandbank in the middle of a great big ocean. And as Panopira, the sun, and Wheatley, the moon, did their many travels across the sky, they dropped seeds. And those seeds grew the island into the island that we know today. However, one day, Moini, the great southern star, he reached down, he took some soil from this land, he took it back up to the creation, and he combined our body, the land, with our spirit. And he made us the people. And he sent us star hopping all the way back down to the land where we've lived for always. So our creation story tells us we've always lived here, that there's never not been a time as Aboriginal people we have not lived in Lutruwita, Tasmania. So that concept, we come from the land, we live as part of the land, and when we die, we go back to the land. And that is why ochre, or the Aboriginal clay paint that you see us put on our body, we put that on our body because it signifies our connection to the land, our belonging to the land, because we believe we're rubbing the blood of Mother Earth on our bodies. That's why we take that ochre, rub it on our bodies. So that's really important, that we feel we've been here for always. However, Western culture, like I said, and we're going back to the numbers thing, or you're 100% or you're this percent Aboriginal. Again, Western culture values things through numbers, whether it's percentages or time frame or money. Numbers is the thing that Western culture measures importance. Western culture tells us we've been here for 60,000 years through our cultural burns and our fire stick farming. And through that fire stick farming, we created phenomenal button grassland highways or hunting grounds. And in the northeast of Tasmania, they did testing of the soil there that took human impact of fire, so human deliberately lit fires back 60,000 years. So we're not talking about mainland Aboriginal culture here, mainland Australia, we're talking about just Tasmania. So Western science says that Tasmanian Aboriginal people have been here for a minimum of 60,000 years through our cultural burns. And then we move to the next image where I'm guessing most of you have drove over the Kudalina or Brighton bypass. And what a lot of people don't realise is that we wanted to protect that site because they found 47,500-year-old stone tools. And so those are our oldest stone tools in Tasmania, and they rival the Egyptian pyramids by 42,000 years, where Western culture considers the ancient pyramids ancient, but they're happy to build and destroy, build a highway and destroy Aboriginal heritage here in Lutruwita, Tasmania. And so the stone tools found at Brighton are dated back 47,500 years. So quite significant. And we're not talking about remote areas, we're talking about built up urban areas as well. Our hand stencils, our painting, our traditional paintings from our artwork, our circles and our lines through our hand stencils in caves date between that 15 to 30,000 mark. So they're phenomenally old. So old that in some of those mountain ranges that, the mountain caves have moved since we've put that artwork there. So that's how old some of that artwork is. And then we keep coming down the timeline and we get to this next one. Yes, this one here. And this is what a lot of people don't realise, and this is a big shock to people. So about 18,000 years ago, if you look on the left-hand side, this is actually what Tasmania looked like, and this is how we're connected to mainland Australia. And so what you'll notice is the Bass Strait, in our language we call it Taiaricha, but the Bass Strait was actually a huge plain. And King Island, Flinders Island, Cape Barren Island, Clark Island were all mountain ranges within this plain. And in the middle of that strait, what you'll see there is a phenomenal freshwater lake. So you look at our Great Lakes that we've got now, and then you look at that big lake and the lake surrounding it. The Great Lakes are nothing in comparison to what we had in the middle of the Bass Strait there. And so that's a phenomenal freshwater system that provides so much food and resources. And so our people would use that plane to travel all over Lutruwita, Tasmania, but also use that particular spot as a trading spot with other nations from around Australia. And so I'm highlighting that because what a lot of people don't realise, also if you look at the coastline, it's a lot further out. It's about 10 to 20 kilometres further out. So a lot of our culture actually sits underwater. In fact, 90% of our time, culture sits underwater. So, you know, the big bass link that they're building from here to Tassie, here to Victoria, sorry, people are going, why do we have to consult with Aboriginal people? Because you're destroying Aboriginal heritage that rivals anything that we have on the top layer. So that's why they have to talk and consult with us. But it was about 11,500 years. What happened is the sea started to rise and the Bass Strait started to flood. And you'll see on the right-hand side there, we see our Flinders Island, what we call the Flinders Island Bridge in connection to mainland Australia start to disconnect. So we've now become isolated. And by 10,000 years ago, it now looks like what it does today. The Bass Strait has fully formed. And we're completely isolated as a civilization from mainland Australia and any other civilization in the world. So what I'm saying is that Aboriginal people in Tasmania, we've been here for 50,000 years longer than the Bass Strait has actually existed. So just put that into your mindset to how long we've been here. The Bass Strait is for us recent history, not a long time ago. So the Bass Strait formed, we became the most isolated civilization in the world. And then we had no contact with anybody for 10,000 years until the Spanish and the Dutch and the British arrived in late 1700s, early 1800s. That's quite phenomenal, isn't it, when you put it that way? And when you consider that we're isolated as a civilizations for longer than the Egyptian pyramids have existed, I think that's a phenomenal thing that people don't consider to our ability to adapt and thrive. What it highlights is a complex governance system. So most people call us nomadic hunters and gatherers wandered with no purpose. This highlights that we had a real complex governance system, and the British knew it. Their intention was to bring all that undone. I mentioned about our hand stencils, but then we move through to the impacts of British colonisation, but I wanted to highlight this just before we move on quickly, because I can see Lauren with her eyes saying, you need to hurry up, we're running out of time.
Not at all.
And so before British colonisation invasion, if you look at that map on the left-hand side, what you'll notice that we had 9 unique nations. So prior to British colonisation invasion, we had 9 unique distinct nations, and within those nations we had clans and we had family groups. And so what's really important is that we spoke up to 16 unique distinct languages. So take French, German, Polish, Dutch, I could keep going on. As unique and different those languages are from each other, we had 16 of them. And then we had different dialects of those languages according to the clans and the family groups you came from. So a family group was your immediate family, mum, dad, nan, pops, aunties, uncles, etc. And you would have about 50. And family groups played the same role as local council. Then you had clans, which is the red dots that you see on that map. We call them clans. And those clans are a makeup of 10 to 15 family groups. And so they play the same role as state government. And then you see a nation, and a nation is a makeup of around 5 to 10 clans. And they form what we can know as federal government today. So take a Europe, condense it, times it by 2, put it in Tassie, and that's what we had prior to British colonisation invasion. A very complex but rich culture. On the right-hand side there, what you will see is our traditional highways and hunting grounds that were created through the fire stick farming and the hunting grounds. What you'll notice is that those pathways cross into other family groups, clans and nations. So when we talk about welcome to countries and acknowledgements, this is that process of travelling for seasonal purposes and having to be welcomed and acknowledged into other nations, clans and family groups areas. What you'll also note is that a lot of our major highways today, including our smaller highways, are built on these traditional button grasses. Why? Because there was no trees to clear. we had already cleared it through that fire-stick farming. So you're actually driving over heritage all the time. You don't actually really know. All right, so just to fast forward, I just wanted to highlight a few things, and let's move it on. I'll get you to read that quickly. I'll give you 30 seconds to read this one, and I'll talk this one through with you. So this is documentation of the first massacre of Aboriginal people in Tasmania. And this massacre occurred at Pure Kitten of Risdon Cove, where over 300 of our people were massacred by the British. And they were doing a communal hunt. And the communal hunt is a whole clan. So we're talking about 10 to 15 family groups gathering to do a hunt for big ceremony. And so they gathered here at Risdon Cove, which is the site across from the Risdon prison on the hill. And they gathered at Risdon Cove to do this hunt. They watched Aboriginal people walk down to the bottom of the hill where they massacred over 300 of our people. When they realised they hadn't massacred all of that clan, they chased them up the river system, which is now the Eastern Highway, up to the Risdon prison, where they massacred the rest of our people in that clan. What a lot of people don't realise is there was only a few survivors of that massacre here in 1803. Or it was 1804 the massacre actually occurred, sorry. And one of them was a small child, an Aboriginal boy who was taken and named Robert Hobart May. And he became the first documented stolen child in Australia. So that's really important to note, is that not only was this massacre quite phenomenal, and we drive past it every day and don't realise we're driving past a massacre site, we also don't realise that Risdon Prison is built on a massacre site and a heritage site as well, where our boys and men would go to make stone tools. But as the highest incarcerated people in the world, our people are locked up in that prison at high rates on a massacre site, overlooking another massacre site. So it's just that condescending nature of consideration that's not given to Aboriginal people. Out of this massacre too, they dissected our people, put our people in, dipped our people in lime to remove their flesh, and took bones to Sydney for scientific interest. And the reason they did this is because they classified us as animals, and they wanted to find the missing link between us and gorillas, humans and gorillas, and they thought we're the missing link. And so why the British were able to claim terra nullius is because they claimed us as not being human. And so they could take the land by force without actually breaking international law. So it wasn't just science that was saying we weren't human, it was also economics. They needed the land, the British, but it was also religion. Christianity had released a document that said, if you're not human, if you're not Christian, we do not consider you human. And so that was the brutality of the British. They just wanted to annihilate Aboriginal people specifically here in Tasmania. And documentation was actually provided of this massacre in a newspaper in Sydney. So this is an actual where we got the details of this massacre to its depth, was from a paper article that was put in a paper in Sydney. Why I highlight this is for two reasons, is that there was no worries in publishing these massacres in papers because there was no crime to kill animals. There was no crime to kill us, we're just animals. And then why did they share it out of Tassie? Why didn't they publish it in papers in Tasmania? The reason being is because there was a level of benefit to keeping the general population ignorant about the treatment of Aboriginal people. So they publicised this stuff in newspapers elsewhere. This one's the New South Wales paper. So I'm mindful of time here, and I will move on, but I will share with you this one in particular. So if you could have a read of this one. So why I'm sharing this one is because what it highlights the brutality of the British on Aboriginal people. You've got to remember we were animals, and at this time also in the 1820s they had a bounty out on Aboriginal people. So convicts as well as farmers, etc., were paid £5 per adult and £2 per child for every child or Aboriginal person adult they killed. And so that was an incentive by the British government at that time because they just wanted to get rid of us. So I wanted to highlight that is the intention here, that they wanted to annihilate my people from existence. They didn't want us to exist, and that was the brutality that they're willing to go to. And we heard about this massacre through oral storytelling, but again, it was published in the New South Wales newspaper. So it just kind of highlights that intention as well there. So as I fast forward, I am going to fast forward a little bit just to give you some context as well. We do have the massacre here that was recorded by George Augustus Robertson at Ketgarim up in the northwest there, where the British actually pushed Aboriginal women and children off the cliff to their death because the day before Aboriginal men had killed their livestock in hope that it would scare them off. But in retaliation, it was documented that they really wanted to drive fear into Aboriginal people. And how do you do that? You target women and children. And so it worked. It scared our people in that area. What I will provide you with is you can read further about these massacres that George Augustus Robertson wrote called Friendly Missions. Now, if you're not a reader, it's not the book for you. If you can get it on podcast, do that way. But if you are a keen reader, then this would be a good one for you. All right, so I'm going to kind of rush through a little bit. What I will highlight is this is the letter by the 1840s. They had rounded up all Aboriginal people. So we've gone from a population of 30,000+ down to no more than 400 Aboriginal people. And they had isolated us to Waibelina on Flinders Island. And this was a petition sent by the Aboriginal people to Queen Victoria to request our sovereignty and our freedom. So our people had adapted and changed enough to be able to learn English, speak English, but also understand the British government system to write Queen Victoria letter. So this was a letter by our people on Waibelina to the Queen requesting our sovereignty. So by the 1860s, we had no more than 40 Aboriginal people left, and a lot of them were the women who were kidnapped and sexually enslaved and taken to the islands. And most of our community are descendant of those women today. So out of those 9 nations and clans that we talked about before, only one nation survived British colonisation invasion. 8 of them have been completely wiped out. And so the remaining of our community is actually on 20 Aboriginal women. So we're all descendant of those 20 Aboriginal women. And because of our isolation to Waibelina, we're also not given native title. Because in native title, you have to prove a continuous physical connection to your traditional lands. And what the Tasmanian government can prove is that we're all isolated and taken from our traditional lands to the islands. So we don't actually get native title. Now, just a few dates before I wrap it up. 1st of January 1901 is the beginning of the Australian Federation. We moved from going from British subjects to Australian citizens. All of us at that point, except for Aboriginal people, still at this time, Aboriginal people are not considered citizens, let alone, pardon me, we're not considered human still. So we're not given the basis of being human yet. And so we celebrate Australia Day on January 26th, but what a lot of people don't realise is that January 26th is the date the British put their flag in the ground, claimed Terra Nullius, and the brutality followed. Hence the reason we won't celebrate Australia Day on January 26th, but we're happy to do it on other days that don't represent British invasion. So really important to note that, and I encourage you to do further research. It was in the 1950s, 60s, they closed down Cape Barren Island and they forced Aboriginal people off the islands and into mainland Tasmania. So this is where people are first getting the idea that Aboriginal people do exist, that Truganini wasn't the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person, and all of a sudden there's all these Aboriginal people about because they forced us off the islands into suburbs like Invermay, Penguin and West Moona. It was by the 1967 with the referendum, we finally were acknowledged as human. So it was in 1967, post-World Wars, and we're also given citizenship at that time and the right to get welfare. So I might add, my mother was born in 1963. So, and I'm 35 years of age. So I'm the first generation of my family to be born, considered human, and as an Australian citizen. However, it wasn't until 1995 the Tasmanian government finally acknowledged there were actually Tasmanian Aboriginal people still here. It took them to 1995. So my middle child, and my youngest, 14, and who's 13, and Talai, who's 11. They were the first to be born considered human, citizen, and is actually existing, and they're only 13, 14 years of age. So this is not past context. We're talking about very, very much living context, which a lot of people don't realise. And then in Tasmania today, we have around 10 to 15,000 palawa, Tasmanian Aboriginal people. But we also have a lot of Aboriginal people who live here from the mainland, which takes it up to about that 30,000 number. So we have over 30,000 people identify as being Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. All right, sorry about that. I've rushed that last bit for you guys, but I hope you still got something new in all this and that you're learning something new. So what I will do is hand it over for questions. You can unmute to ask the question, or you can chuck it in the comments section. But we might got 5 minutes. Do you reckon, Lauren? We can allow 5?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We've still got quite a few online. So if anybody has any questions, please, place them in the chat or unmute and ask Dewayne while we've got him. Fascinating. I could listen all day. Same. Just it's a pity we've only got an hour. But are there any questions?
Don't be scared. I've had a hot chocolate today. I'm feeling good this morning. So ask away.
I'm sure there are some questions.
While we wait, if there's any questions, is that I encourage you to go out and get a book called Tasmanian Aborigines by Lyndall Wright. So I will write that into, I never get to spell a name right, but Tasmanian Aborigines, or Aboriginals, I should say, Lyndall Wright. That is a great book to read and has a lot of really good stuff in it. So I encourage you to read that as a beginning point.
We have two questions that have come through.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, my husband has a business and is reluctant to ask his workforce who is an Aboriginal person. How can he ask the question?
Well, yeah, it's about, it is about acknowledging intent. So if your intention is to go, I'm asking this question because I want to build cultural safety, I want to know how I can support you more within the work. We actually encourage you to do it. You're not going to offend anybody by asking the question. We want you to do it because it allows you to support us appropriately. It's just the way you ask it. So rather than going, are you of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, we prefer you to say, do you identify as being Aboriginal or Torres